Good evening, everyone. Can I ask you all, please, to take a seat so we can get started? Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Frank McCabe, Vice President of Global Information Systems, and a very warm welcome to all of you. The Distinguished Speakers Program has been designed to expand your DECWORLD experience by bringing experts on topics that have a critical impact on your organization. Our guest today, Dr. Michael Hammer, is the foremost authority on business process reengineering, a subject that appears on the top of most major corporations in the world today. Dr. Hammer is presently engaged in assisting large corporations, including ourselves, in successfully mobilizing for and implementing the re-engineering process to achieve dramatic improvements in performance. Certainly a goal that all of us wish to achieve. He was formerly a professor of computer science at MIT, where he led pioneering research efforts in database management, office automation, and electronic publishing. He is a founder and director of several high technology firms and has published extensively in management reviews and technical literature. I know you'll all find Dr. Hammer's ideas on how to re-engineer your core business processes and your organization to face the competitive challenges ahead most interesting. Let's welcome Dr. Michael Hammer.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today, though I confess a little bit of a different experience for me. I usually don't have occasion to address dinner theaters at the end of the day. It's also a little intimidating for me, having looked at the other speakers who've been on this podium the last week or so, to see who I have to follow. After looking at last week, you had Henry Kissinger and Bill Gates and Helmut Schmidt. I feel a little bit like I'm playing backup horn to the Archangel Gabriel. Let me lay down sort of two rules and assumptions that I work under here. The first one of which is that despite all appearances, this is not a lecture. I don't do lectures. I spent 10 years as a professor at MIT, and I gave all the lectures that I ever want to give in the rest of my life, especially since I once read that the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant defined a lecture as a process by means of which the notes of the professor become the notes of the student without passing through the minds of either one. Not an encouraging precedent. So whatever this is, it's not a lecture, it's some sort of shared experience. And what we're going to do is two things to try to achieve that. First of all, at the end, we'll have a little bit of time for questions. I'm suspecting 15 minutes, every one of you will have a chance to ask a question. And also, I'm going to have to try to talk pretty quickly. I've got a fair amount of material that I want to get through. We're making the following no-cost offer. If, for reasons best known to yourselves, you'd like to have a copy of the material I'm speaking from, when you leave, just leave on the table either a business card or one of your DEC barcoded insignia, and we'll see to it that you get a copy of these remarks so that you have something to remember this by and you don't have to take feverish notes. The other expectation I have, I confess, is I have one strong expectation of you, is that I expect mental agility and alertness. Now, I know that's a lot to expect at 5 o'clock, the end of a busy day. Let me tell you what I mean. And it's a story best described in terms of an event that occurred about a year ago, a meeting held between Mr. Bush and Mr. Gorbachev. And they were talking about the problems they had in hiring high-quality personnel. And Mr. Gorbachev said, "That's not a problem, I've got that solved." What I do, you see, said Mr. Gorbachev, is I find young people who look smart and intelligent and on the ball, and I give them a mental agility test. And if they pass it, I hire them and I train them and they work out very well. For example, years ago, he said, I met the young Edward Shevardnadze. And I said to him, tell me, Edward, who is your father's son that's not your brother? Edward thought for a second, and he said, that's me, of course. And he was right, and I hired him, and he's worked out very well. Well, Mr. Bush thinks this is a terrific idea, and he decides he's going to take it home and try it out on the White House staff, White House personnel. And who's the first person he decides to try it on? Dan Quayle, that's right. He says, come in here, Dan, I have a question for you. Tell me, Dan, who's your father's son that's not your brother? Dan is stumped. He don't get it. Nothing happens. Mr. Bush gets annoyed. He leaves. Dan starts to sweat. Is George going to drop me on the ticket? So he runs upstairs to Dick Cheney's office, and he says, Dick, help me out. Tell me quick. Who's your father's son that's not your brother? And Dick Cheney says, that's easy, Dan. That's me, of course. And Dan Quayle says, thanks, Dick. Wait a minute. And he runs upstairs to George Bush's office, and he says, George, I've got the answer. It's Dick Cheney. And George Bush says, no, it's not Dan, it's Edward Shevardnadze. So if you didn't see the second one coming, you're not alert. In searching for a title for this little address, I too have noticed that re-engineering has become just a wee bit tad of an overused term. And you see, since I made it up, I get to define it. And what I'd like to do is focus on the reality of re-engineering. To too many organizations, re-engineering is becoming a term du jour. It's a popular term. We take out last year's plans that didn't get funded. We put a re-engineering label on them, and we hope we'll squeeze them by that way. Well, you won't get that by me, I'll tell you. And I always like to have a subtitle. The subtitle of this talk is In the Footsteps of Leonid Kravchuk. Now there's a current affairs test for you. Who in the world is Leonid Kravchuk? Anyone know? Who's Leonid Kravchuk? Yes, that's nobody. Good. Henry Kissinger would be disappointed. Oh, Henry, you do know. Good. Leonid Kravchuk is the president of the Ukraine. I was in Europe recently, and I heard an address that he gave to the Ukrainian parliament. It began as follows. Yesterday, he said, the Ukraine stood poised on the verge of a great abyss. Today, we have taken a great step forward. Re-engineering feels like that to a lot of people. Let me put it simply. What is the deal? What is the issue with regard to re-engineering? I think it can be boiled down to one very simple issue. Large organizations in the US, Canada, Western Europe, large organizations today are trying to compete in the 1990s with businesses and organizations that were designed for the 1950s. It's that simple. We live in a world today which is characterized for me by three words, three very easy words: customers, competition, and change. We live in a world in which customers have the upper hand, in which suppliers of any sort, whether of products or services, whether to consumers or industrial companies, do not have the luxury of dictating the terms and singing the tune to which customers will dance. Rather, customers have power. Customers have sophistication. Customers have strength. Customers dictate the terms. Suppliers have to respond to them. Competition. We no longer live in an environment of genteel and mild competition. We live in a world of intense, international, global, cutthroat competition, in which if you drop the ball for a quarter of a second, there's someone eager to pick it up and pound you over the head with it. And we live in a world of change. Whatever you think is the winning formula today will be obsolete by tomorrow. Intense competition, strong customers, relentless change. That's the name of the game. Everybody recognizes that. I visit lots of companies and they all complain about it. They say they're not ready to handle it. I say, what are you going to do about it? They say, no problem. And they open up the bottom desk drawer and they take out the chairman's latest brochure, written in very elegant prose and printed on 4-color glossy stock with an ennobling title like Vision 2000 or Enterprise 2000. And it's really interesting because it doesn't matter who your company is or what your business is, these damn brochures all sound the same. And they all talk about the same things that we're going to be good at, the themes we're going to excel at. What are those? In a world of customers, competition, and change, we're going to be good at 3 things. The first is quality and service. That's what we're going to be good at. We're all going to wear our Q lapel pins. Now, quality is a very popular term, but it's also one that's not well understood. I'll give you a good 3-word definition of quality. Very simple definition. Meeting customer expectations. That's what quality means. What's the first thing you're going to do if you're going to meet customer expectations? The first thing you have to do is not know what their expectations are. That's the second thing. The first thing you have to do is know who your customers are. I visit a lot of companies and I say, tell me, who are your customers? You know what they say? They say, oh, those are the people that buy our stuff. I say, I knew that! Who are they? Tell me about them. Then tell me what they expect. Then tell me how well you're doing against it. And then tell me how you're going to bridge that gap. That's what quality is all about. By the way, in quality, there's a big bit of a competition in nomenclature. It used to be that what we wanted to do is meet customer expectations. No, that's no longer enough. Now we want to exceed customer expectations. Very good. It used to be we wanted to satisfy the customer. Then it was we were going to please the customer. Now we're going to delight the customer. I have to tell you something. I don't want to know what comes next. Quality. And closely allied with quality is service. What do we mean by service? Most companies don't have a clue. Most companies think that service is a matter of smiles and attitudes. I talked to a manufacturing company recently. I said, how are you doing on service? They said, we're doing great. I said, you are? Really? How's that? They said, well, in the bad old days, if we had a problem and a customer called up, the customer would say, where's my order? And in the bad old days, we would have to say, we don't know, we'll look into it, we'll get back to you. That's the bad old days. We don't do that no more. No, today if a customer calls up and says, where's the order? Today we say, we don't know, we'll look into it, we'll call you back, have a nice day. That's service, they tell me. That's not service, that's crap. I have a simple rule. If the taxi cab's engine is broken, I don't care if the driver is friendly. Service is not a matter of attitudes. Service is a matter of performance. Our business has to operate in a way to meet the customer needs. That's what quality and service is about. If we're going to live in a world of change, we have to be good at innovation and flexibility. We have to be able to turn on a dime. We have to lower our cycle times. We have to go improve our speed to market. We have to see what's coming and do something about it. And by the way, both are very important. You can't get by with just one. Just seeing what's coming isn't enough. Will Rogers once said, even if you're on the right track, you'll still get run over if you're just sitting there. It's necessary to do something too. And in a world of intense global competition, cost minimization, total cost reduction, that's the critical theme. Quality, service, innovation, flexibility, cost reduction, lean and mean, that's the way we got to be for the 90s. Everybody knows that. But then I say to them, how you doing against that? And they said, oh, terrible. That's not the way we are. That's the way we want to be. And I ask, what are you like? And they say, oh, we're bureaucratic, we're slow, we're lethargic, we're unresponsive, we're inflexible, we're rigid, we're introspective, we can't stand risk, and we think long-term means what we're going to have for lunch on Friday. And I say to them, why are you like that? And I said, how did it come to be? What happened? Did a bunch of airheads get together and say, hey, let's design the worst company we can imagine? No, because I don't think their design skills are up to it. How did we get that way? Well, what they first want to say is we've always been that way, but that doesn't answer it. That doesn't answer it. Because how did we get that way in the first place? The way I deal with that is by saying as follows. I just gave you a list of very negative words, full of bad karma, not good vibes, you know, bureaucratic, slow, lethargic, and stuff like that. What if we had other words that had less emotive content that expressed the same ideas? They might be words like cautious, conservative, controlled, analytic, careful. To put it another way, when you need to be flexible and innovative and you are controlled and careful, it feels bureaucratic and unresponsive. I repeat the question. How did we get to be so cautious and controlled and conservative when what we need to be is flexible and innovative and quality and service oriented? The answer is simple. It used to be a good idea. There's nothing wrong with our organizations. Our organizations are fine. It's the world that's in trouble. There's a story about Einstein. Einstein was teaching physics at Princeton. One day he gave his secretary an exam to pass out to his graduate students. She looked at it and she said, Professor Einstein, I think you've made a mistake. This is the same exam you gave last year. Aren't you concerned that the students will know the answers? He looked at it for a moment. He said, ach, it's all right, you see. The questions are the same, but the answers are different. We've got the reverse situation. We've got the same answers. The trouble is the questions have changed. We've got a certain way of doing business, which was great in the 1950s. The trouble is it don't work in the 1990s. What were the 1950s like? Think back to that halcyon period. Think about the things you worry about today. You worry about difficult customers today. What advice did you give a difficult customer in 1955? 1955 was a wonderful time, remember? That was in the middle of the Eisenhower interregnum when the White House was vacant for 8 years. It was a terrific time to do business. If you had a customer who came to you and complained in 1955, what advice did you give a customer with a complaint in 1955? I'll tell you what advice you gave him. That's the advice you gave him. In other words, get to the back of the line. We don't need your sort around here. We have lots of good customers. What's the definition of a good customer? Customer who takes whatever nonsense we're dishing out. That's a good customer. We don't need you. We're in a supply-constrained environment. You got a complaint? Find somebody else. We don't want to hear from you. You think about international competition, we didn't have any in 1955. You think about rapid product development and short product life cycles. No, in those days we had 10 and 15, 20-year product life cycles. In the automobile industry, there was no significant change in product from 1949 to 1973. 24-year period, essentially no innovation except tail fins. We didn't worry about those things. It was a period of unrestrained growth. You opened your mail in the morning, you got 10% growth. It was terrific. What did you worry about? You worried about capacity management. You worried about managing that growth. You didn't have to generate it. It came to you for free. You didn't worry about customers. You didn't worry about products. You worried about planning and control. Somehow planning came to the top of the corporate food chain. This hit me very hard in the late 1950s. It was 1972. I was, they're still awake. I was working for GE at the time, not under Jack Welch, whom I consider a great leader, but under that other guy, the demented financial type. Actually, that's a redundancy, isn't it? Sort of like criminal lawyer. And I remember in GE in those days, they had 2 cardinal sins you could commit. My first day on the job, I said, what are those 2 cardinal sins? They told me the first cardinal sin you could commit at GE was not making your plan, coming in under your numbers. I said, okay, that makes sense. I wrote it down. I said, what's the second cardinal sin? They said, the second cardinal sin is coming in over your numbers. I said, excuse me, I don't get it. Isn't that good? Don't you wish to make more money? And they looked at me with withering contempt. And they said, any fool can execute. We're looking for people who can plan. The arrogance, the hubris, that if we make a plan, we can assume the market will follow it. I still see vestiges of this in organizations with titles like profit planning. I like to tell people that profit is not something for which we plan. Profit is something for which we pray. If at the end of the harvest season the corn gods have been kind, then we have something to live on, otherwise we die in the winter. Control and planning came to dominate our organizations. The trouble is that was a mindset for the 1950s. It's not a mindset for the 1990s. What are our businesses like? Our businesses are based on 2 very simple ideas. 2 simple ideas that are wired very deeply into everything we believe about how large organizations should operate. The first of those ideas is specialization of labor. Very simple idea. Do you know who invented that idea? It was not Frederick Taylor. It was not Henry Ford. It was Adam Smith. In 1776, in The Wealth of Nations, Chapter 1, entitled The Division of Labor, I hope you can hear the U in the way I pronounce that, he described a pin factory. He said, making a pin involves 18 specialized tasks. One person has to cut the wire, someone else has to straighten it, someone else has to make the head, someone else puts the head on the pin, someone else paints it, and someone else puts it in the paper. 18 different specialized steps. He said he visited a pin factory with 10 people working there, each one of which did either 1 or 2 specialized tasks. By having that specialization, they were able to make 50,000 pins a day. While people making whole pins themselves, 10 people might have made 100 pins a day. What's the virtue of specialization of labor? It leads to real strong task efficiency. It leads to minimization of setup and transfer time. You don't have to put down one set of tools and pick up another one. It leads to the possibility of mechanization. It leads to minimal amounts of time needed for training. Specialization of labor is great when you are in a growth path that looks like that. It was invented by Adam Smith. It was refined by Taylor and Ford. And it still resides in the way in which we have organized our companies. We have taken whole activities, think about filling an order, and broken it down into little pieces. To fill an order in a manufacturing company typically takes 13 to 20 different steps, which are typically performed by 10 to 15 different departments. First, we enter and verify the order. That's in sales administration. Then we do a credit check. That's in finance. Then we do an inventory check. That's in distribution. Then we do a back order interface with manufacturing planning. Then we do a scheduling, which is in logistics. Then we schedule the carrier, which is in traffic planning, and so on. We have broken the activity down into lots of specialized pieces. That's the principle of specialization of labor. The other principle, it goes right along with it, and was expressed most clearly by Alfred P. Sloan. And it is the idea of hierarchical management, of breaking down an organization into its pieces, putting all the people doing a specialized task in a group together, putting a supervisor over them, a manager over a group of supervisors, a director over a group of managers, and building up a hierarchy which is controlled by plans that come down and results that go up. That's the way your companies run. Specialization of labor and hierarchical management. It worked great in the 1950s. It's going to kill you in the 1990s. You think about the simple activity of filling an order. Who in your company is in charge of order fulfillment, of getting an order from the customer, taking through all those steps, and getting it out to the customer and having the customer satisfied and pay his bills? Who is in charge of that? The answer is what you just said. The answer is nobody. Nobody is in charge of the key activities on our organizations. Everybody is in charge of little pieces. There's a very troubling line in a movie that I once saw, a movie called Absence of Malice. Any of you ring a bell? Starring Paul Newman. The plot in one sentence is that Paul Newman, the character he plays, is believed by the Justice Department to have some important information. And the Justice Department and the newspapers are pressuring him to release it, except he doesn't have it. So they end up publishing some embarrassing information about a friend of his in order to pressure him. The friend is so embarrassed that the friend commits suicide. In the last scene, Paul Newman is sitting there in a room with people from the press and people from the Justice Department, and he says the following. He says, everybody here is smart. Everybody here is doing their job. And my friend is dead. You know what? We can say that about your companies. Everybody in your company is smart. Everybody is doing their jobs. And the company is going to hell in a handbasket. Why? Because nobody is in charge of the big things. Nobody looks this way at the processes that cross organizational boundaries, that deliver value to the customer. Everybody is focused this way, hierarchically, on the tasks and functions that go through the company rather than across it. Cross-functional processes are the most important thing in your company, and nobody is paying attention to them. Your cross-functional processes are fragmented. Fragmented processes never deliver quality, they never deliver service, they are fundamentally inflexible, and they cost an arm and a leg because of all the overhead that they generate. What we need to do is not improve those processes. What we have to do is not make them better. What we have to do is nuke them. What we have to do is replace those processes with radically new designs that are designed to take advantage of 20th century computer technology and meet the requirements of the 1990s and beyond. Here's my opening definition of re-engineering. It is the fundamental rethinking and radical redesign of business processes to achieve dramatic improvements in performance. Now, there are three very important words in there. The first is dramatic. I said dramatic improvements in performance. If you are 10% away from where you need to be in terms of performance, if your costs are 10% too high, if your service and quality levels are 10% too low, if your cycle times are 10% off where they should be, I say to you, don't complain. If your problems are that you're 10% away from where you need to be, you're smart, you'll work hard, you'll get it done, and my advice to you is keep far away from re-engineering. It has nothing to offer you. Re-engineering is not for where you need to make yourself 10% better. Re-engineering is for when you need to make yourself 10 times better. When you're an order of magnitude away from where you need to be, that's where re-engineering comes into play. The second key word in my definition is radical. Radical is derived from the Latin word radix, which means root. It's also the source for the English word radish, which I'm sure will be of a lot of help to you in your work. Re-engineering is not about tinkering with what you have. Re-engineering is not about rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Re-engineering is getting to the heart, to the essence, to the very basis, the root of how we work, extirpating it root and branch and replacing it with something else. And the third, most critical word in my definition of re-engineering is the word processes. That's what it's about. It's not about tasks. It's not about functions. It's not about organizations. It's not about departments. It's not about strategy. It's not about any of that nonsense. It's about how the work is done, how you create value and deliver value to customer. Let me give you a couple quick examples of what I mean by re-engineering. The first is some work that's been done at Kodak in their product development activities. In particular, product development of what are called single-use cameras. That's a nice euphemism. They tell me I have to call them single-use cameras. I'm not allowed to call them disposable cameras, because that's not ecological. That's like calling a used car a previously owned vehicle. These single-use cameras, they had a real problem with. You've seen these single-use cameras. They're real neat. They take great pictures. Where do you buy them? You buy them either at the point where you're going to take the picture, or you buy them at the checkout lane in the supermarket or the drugstore. The place where you're going to use them, the photo kiosk at Disney World or the checkout lane at the drugstore, have one thing in common. What they have in common is very little shelf space. Basically, buying one of those things is an impulse purchase, sort of like buying a mini computer. And it's very important to be first to the market there. Kodak heard that Fuji was working on a single-use camera and was going to beat them to the market because Kodak's product development cycle was 70 weeks, 70 weeks. And if they took the normal approach, they would be beaten by Fuji. Fuji would take all the shelf space and they'd be in trouble. They did a re-engineering of product development. The traditional approach, of course, had been that they do an overall product design, then they break it down into a bunch of subsystem designs, someone working on a lens, someone working on a shutter, someone working on a film advance, someone working on a power supply, and after all the subsystems are designed, they integrate them together and test them. That's the traditional approach. Of course, in integrate and test, you discover that the pieces don't fit, and you have to go back and start over with redesign. Why don't they fit? Because nobody's been talking to each other. You find that there were 2 millimeters tolerance between the film and the power supply, and they both used it. And when you figure it out, it's too late, and you got to start over. What they did is very simple. They gave everybody a CAD-CAM station, which by itself accomplished nothing. By the way, if you've just landed from Mars, that means, of course, computer-aided design, computer-aided manufacturing. The critical point was not the CAD-CAM system per se, but the fact that they were all connected to a shared product design database, which is updated on a nightly basis. In other words, at the end of the day, I've done my work, I hit a file key, and it goes to an integrated product database. The next morning I come to work, the first thing that happens is the overall design gets downloaded into my workstation. And the first thing I see is whether any of you heathen barbarians working on this product along with me have messed around in my space. And if you have, I see your name and address and phone number right up there on the screen. And I pick up the phone and I call you, and I have what my English friends would recall a full and frank exchange of views. Which means I attempt to strangle you in the telephone cord. And by the end of the day, we have resolved our differences. By the end of the day, we've solved the problem, we've straightened it out. We've done it today, not 6 months from now. By taking this approach, that's called concurrent engineering, Kodak has taken 50% of the time out of the product development cycle, and they've lowered manufacturing and tooling costs about 25%. Why? Because the manufacturing engineers are now involved in the design process. They don't wait for the design to be finished and catch the result and say, oh my God, how are we going to build this? They're involved from day one. That's re-engineering. Why is it re-engineering? It looked not at an individual task. It didn't look at the shutter design. It didn't look at the film design. It looked at the overall product design. Secondly, it went for massive improvement. It didn't say, how can we improve it by 5%? It said, how can we do at least a 50% time reduction? How was it re-engineering? They were willing to break rules about how things worked. And how was it re-engineering? It involved the creative use of information technology. Give you one other example of re-engineering. And this one I have to be a little discreet in describing. Let's just say that this one involves a large discount retailer based in Arkansas and a major consumer goods manufacturer from Cincinnati. And if you figure out it's Walmart and P&G, you're awful smart. This story involves the way in which Walmart buys disposable diapers from Procter & Gamble. Used to be that Walmart would keep inventory in their warehouse. When they noticed the inventory levels were low, they would issue a reorder to P&G, which would send the diapers and then issue a bill. One day, Walmart got an idea. They came to P&G and they said, listen up, guys. It seems to us, to tell you the truth, that you folks actually know more about diaper movement, so to speak, than we do. So instead of us deciding when we're going to reorder, we'll just send you on a daily basis the inventory levels in our warehouse. You can run them against a very complicated model you have of diaper utilization, and when you think it's time for us to reorder, you send us a PO. If we like it, we'll sign it and send it back to you. Well, they did this for a while. It worked out real well. In fact, it worked out so well that eventually Walmart said, listen up, guys, from now on, don't send us that PO for us to sign. From now on, just send us the Pampers. In other words, Walmart has outsourced the function of inventory replenishment on their Pampers to the supplier Procter & Gamble. In the trade, this is called continuous replenishment. It's looked at the entire order fulfillment and inventory replenishment function, part of which was within P&G, part of which was within Walmart, compressed it down to a single integrated process. The payoffs to Walmart include not being out of stock, including lower inventory levels, faster turn on inventories, reduced investment, faster cash availability, and not having to pay the people who are actually going to do that inventory management. To P&G, the payoffs include no stockouts in the stores, better relationships, preferred supplier status with Walmart, and no discrepancies, conflicts, and reconciliations needed in the ordering process because Walmart never issues an order in the first place. Again, process orientation, end-to-end, rather than a task and activity focus. That's what re-engineering is about. Now, there are many other things I could say, but I have a little bit of respect for your endeavors, for your endurance after being here a long day. Let me just tell you one other thing before I conclude, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. If you think about the Kodak case that we discussed, it turns out that that change in how they develop products not only changed the process, it changed lots of other things as well. For example, under the old way of developing products, think about a product engineer who was working on shutters. And let's say her name was Sally. And we went to Sally and we asked her, what do you do for a living? She would say, I'm a shutter designer. Under the new way of doing business, you ask Sally what she does for a living, she will not say she's a shutter designer. She'll say she designs cameras. Under the old way of doing things, if you ask Sally what she thought about the guys who worked on film advance and power supply and lens, you asked her what she thought about them, she would say, they're the enemy. They get in the way. They take the pristine integrity of my design and they mess it up. If you ask Sally now what she thinks about those people, she'll say, they're my teammates. If under the old process you ask Sally who is really important to her and whose opinion she values, the answer would be her boss. Under the new process, if you ask Sally who's really important, she'll say, the customer. Under the old way of doing things, all that you needed was Sally to be an engineer. Now you need Sally to be able to work in a team together with these other people. She has to understand not only her own discipline, but theirs as well. She has to think about the customer. Under the old way of doing things, Sally's emphasis was on task productivity. How many shutter designs per cubic week can I do? Under the new way of doing things, Sally cares about the success of the market, success of the camera in the market. Under the old way of doing things, Sally's boss was a supervisor and a controller and probably managed 5 to 10 people like Sally. Under the new way of doing things, Sally's boss is a coach and a teacher and supports 20 to 40 people like Sally. Under the old way of doing things, Sally was compensated for her personal productivity. Under the new way of doing things, Sally is compensated for the results of her entire team. What you have in re-engineering is radical process change, but radical process change engenders enormous change in 3 other dimensions of a company. First, it engenders dramatic change in the definitions of jobs and of the kinds of people you need and the organizational structures in which they are placed. Secondly, that in turn gives enormous rise to enormous change in the measurement and management systems, the ways in which we measure the performance of people and organizations, in which we hire them, compensate them, train them, and develop them. And that in turn leads to enormous change in the values, beliefs, and cultural systems that people keep in their heads. In other words, process change engenders enormous change in jobs, people, structure, measurement, management, and culture. So to say that re-engineering is the radical redesign of processes is a sad understatement. Re-engineering is, in fact, the radical redesign of everything. It starts with process redesign, but it is a Pandora's box. You can't do a little bit of re-engineering. If you start down that road to make radical shifts in the structure of your processes, look out. Nothing within your organization will look anything like it does today. Re-engineering is an all or nothing endeavor. Consequently, we can follow a little chain of what I call ineluctable logic. If you're not familiar with the term ineluctable, it means you can't eluct it. Hey, look it up. It starts as follows. Re-engineering entails industrial strength change. Just think about the before and after for our friend Sally. Re-engineering is intrinsically cross-functional because we focus on processes at cross-functional boundaries. Therefore, re-engineering is a very major undertaking, though in retrospect I don't know if I should use the word undertaking. It has negative connotations. Re-engineering is a big deal in search of big results. Therefore, re-engineering will be resisted. I have no patience with people who tell me that their re-engineering efforts fail because people resist change. That's like saying people can't breathe water. I know that. If re-engineering efforts fail, it is not because people resist change. It is because management does not successfully manage and cope with and diffuse that resistance to change. Therefore, re-engineering only succeeds if it is driven from the top of the organization. There is no bottom-up re-engineering. I have 2 rules about re-engineering. Rule 1, re-engineering does not proceed without a strong executive leader. Rule 2, if you do not have a strong executive leader, consult Rule 1. That is to say, job 1 has got to be to create the impassioned, intense, fanatical leader who will drive that change through the organization. Your collective jobs are to support, enable, and promote that idea, but the spark has got to be lit at the top of the organization, otherwise it will suffocate. Okay, let me conclude. Let me conclude by summarizing what re-engineering is not and what it is. It is not automation. It is not building a system to support what we have. It is not paving the cow paths. It is not repaving the cow paths either. Some of you probably think that re-engineering means taking your old information systems, throwing them away, and replacing them with new information systems that still support obsolete business processes. That's not re-engineering. That's gilding a dead horse. Re-engineering means rethinking the ways in which we work in ways that capitalize on the potential of technology. Re-engineering is not cutting fat. I love it when people tell me they're going to cut fat in their organizations. I say, great, what are you going to do? Find the Department of Waste and Mismanagement and close it down? In large organizations, the fat is not layered on top waiting to be cut. In large organizations, the fat is marbled in. The only way you get it out is by grinding it up and frying it out. A very pleasing metaphor. Re-engineering is not about tinkering or fixing or incrementalism. It's not about rationalizing what we have. It's not about reorganizing and restructuring. What it is two words: starting over. That's what it is. Throwing away what we got and starting from a clean sheet of paper, rejecting conventional wisdom, thinking out of the box, focusing on processes instead of on functions. Basically, when people ask me what I do for a living, I tell them I'm reversing the Industrial Revolution. And that's what re-engineering is about. All right, let me close this part of the session with a couple observations. Then if you have questions, I'll be happy to try to avoid them, and then I'll have a remark or two just before we close the agenda at 6. And I will end this part, and let me remind you, as I said, if you would like a copy of any of this, now that you've had a chance to decide whether or not you're interested, just leave some indicator of what planet you live on the table, and we'll collect them later. First of all, Bert Lance was all wrong. Bert Lance, remember Mr. Bert Lance? How many of you remember Mr. Bert Lance? Right, director of budget under Mr. Carter. He had two famous quotes. First famous quote was, "I didn't do it." The second famous quote was, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it." Poisonous attitude. Poisonous attitude. Much better attitude: if it ain't broke yet, you still got a chance to fix it. Don't wait till it's broke to start thinking about it. If it ain't broke yet, it will be soon. On the other hand, Dorothy Parker and Groucho Marx had it right. Dorothy Parker, kind of hero of mine. She was a writer of the 30s and 40s, famous as a wit. Once they told her that President Calvin Coolidge had died, she replied, "How can you tell?" On another occasion, Dorothy Parker tried to walk through the doorway at the same time as Claire Booth Luce. Claire Booth Luce stepped back and said, "Age before beauty." Dorothy Parker went through the door and said, "Pearls before swine." On another occasion, they asked Dorothy Parker to use the word horticulture in a sentence. She replied, "You can lead a horticulture, but you can't make her think." But I'll explain it later. The relevant observation is that Dorothy Parker was a book reviewer for The New Yorker. And she once wrote in a review, she said, "This book should not be tossed aside lightly. This book should be hurled away with great force." That's what we have to do with our processes. Not push them gently away, kick over the damn table because they're no good at all. Finally, Groucho Marx is the patron saint of re-engineering. In the movie Horse Feathers, he sang a song that is the national anthem of re-engineering. The title of the song was, "Whatever it is, I'm against it." That's the attitude we gotta have. Guilty until proven innocent. If our processes were worth squat, we wouldn't be in the trouble we are. Assume that they're no good and start from there. All right, I'll tell you what, we'll take some questions right now. Yes, there are microphones back there, or you can shout, like me.
Tom Colligan, rather than elect unelectability, wouldn't it be possible to model and simulate the re-engineering processes?
Okay, the question is, can we, if I hear you correctly, can we simulate the kind of processes that we create by means of re-engineering? There's really two questions there. One is, how do we go about creating new processes? And secondly, can we simulate them before we install them? What we have discovered is the following. Many companies are terribly intimidated by the redesign process. They look at it and they say, "My God, how can we think creatively? We don't have skills in this area." It turns out that there are a small number of principles for coming up with new process designs. Not everyone is different. For example, we talked earlier about the Kodak model for new product development. That same structure has been used at a major consumer goods for developing new package designs for packaging on their products. It's also being used in an aerospace company for how they develop documentation for their new products. In other words, it's a model, a template that has a wide variety of applications. The example we talked about at Procter & Gamble at Walmart of laying work off on your supplier has been done at Emerson Electric, has laid off on W.W. Grainger, their motor supplier, their component supplier, much of the function of their purchasing department. In other words, there are maybe a dozen, 15, 20 models for new process structures which you can, in fact, yourselves learn and then come up with your own new process models. And a number of people are starting to work on simulation tools to allow you to assess in advance the performance of those processes before you install them. Yes?
My experience tracks about 99% with what you've laid out. The 1% that it differs, and it's a very important 1%, is when you described a top-down versus a bottom-up. To me, that's a false dichotomy, and I'd like you to respond to that.
Okay. Re-engineering needs to be, let's say, both top-down and bottom-up. Without the participation of people in the line really involved in the process, nothing happens. However, without strong intervention and personal engagement from the top, nothing else happens either. So it is clearly not a one-person effort. It's not the boss who makes it all happen. But without the dedication and fanaticism of someone at the top, no matter how much energy is going on at the bottom, nothing will happen. Because you have to get near the top to have the elevated point of view to get the real cross-functional perspective. I often say that a leader of re-engineering has to be fanatical about it. Churchill defined a fanatic as someone who can't change his mind and won't change the subject. And that's the kind of intensity that we need about re-engineering.
Do you envisage re-engineering the political processes?
Gee, do you think they're broken? Actually, the question of re-engineering in the public sector, broadly speaking, is a really powerful one. There are a number of organizations in the public sector that are doing a lot, though sometimes with some unusual perspectives. One of the most successful that I've run across recently is in the province of Ontario in Canada, the Ministry of Revenue, basically the state tax department from Americans' point of view. And the way they've gone about it is by starting with the perspective of the taxpayer, whom they call their customer. Now, I'm sure you all think of yourselves as IRS customers. In fact, I ran a meeting recently at which I had, about this theme, customer perspective, I had one of the deputy directors of the FBI there. And we were talking about customer perspectives. And I said, I'm sure the FBI is a very terrific organization, but why are you interested in a customer-oriented conference? There were about 300 people in the room. He looked around and he said, I see a lot of potential customers here. True story. Anything else? Okay. Then what I think we're going to do is conclude, but I'm going to do the following. I've looked at the program at these speeches at the end of the day during DECWORLD. There seemed to be an awful lot of politically oriented addresses, and we had a political question here. So I thought I would close with 3 politically related observations. First, from President Calvin Coolidge, whom we've already cited, who once said, when large numbers of men are out of work, unemployment results. Couldn't put anything over on Cal Coolidge. The late Senator S.I. Hayakawa of California was once caught sleeping on the Senate floor. They asked him about it. He said, you see, I'm an insomniac. And the best cure for insomnia is to get a lot of sleep. And then there was Senator Carl Munt of North Dakota, who was once expostulating about the crisis in the Middle East. And he said, I don't understand why the Arabs and the Israelis can't simply sit down and work it out like good Christians. And with that perspective, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Well, Michael, thank you for such a passionate, vigorous, provocative, and enlightening talk. And the response of the audience speaks for itself. Just one piece of information for those going on it. The Spirit of Boston dinner cruise will depart at 6:30 from the dock to the left of the World Trade Center. Thank you very much.